G'day and welcome to another video with Better Pics. Hope this finds you all well. Just a very quick video today. We're going to be looking at curves adjustments within Lightroom. So you can see I have an image here and we are in the develop module just up there on the top right hand side. The reason I've chosen this image is because it is quite contrasty. We've got some really bright skies, some mid-tone sort of greens here as well with the grass, and then some shadow areas as well. So you can see it's quite bright to quite dark, depending on which part of the image you refer to. Needless to say, the light when this photograph was taken is quite lovely, and it works really well for the image and certainly the time of the day, but needless to say it also does have quite a bit of contrast or high contrast light there as well, with, as I've mentioned, very bright to darker shadows. So just wanted to show how using the tone curve within Lightroom you can adjust some of those different parts of the image. So there's certainly some great tools there. Alright, let's get into it. So looking at the tone curve, it's very much the same as the curves adjustment that you have in Adobe Camera Raw, which you would have seen the previous video that I created. And just to go through the basics, the left-hand side of the curve here on the bottom left-hand side is the shadow area, middle section is the midtones, and the right section up the top there is the highlights. You can see overlaid in the background as well as a bit of a histogram just to show what the tonal range of the image is. And the histogram really confirms what I said before, where we have a spike on the right-hand side and a spike on the left-hand side, which means we have more of the image dedicated to brighter parts of the image and more of the image dedicated to darker parts, but there's not a huge amount of mid-tone. There is a little bit there, as I mentioned, the grass there, which is roughly equivalent to middle grey in terms of tonal value. However, as you can see with this curve, we have a lot of options, plus a few extra options on top of what's available in Adobe Camera Raw. So if we just start to click and drag, for example, if I just click and drag in the middle there, you can see overall the image is getting a little bit darker, and then go the other way and the image is getting a little bit brighter. It does work a little bit differently to Adobe Camera Raw in that there aren't any control points there. However, the curve does stay in the shape that it was in once I finish making that adjustment. So if I just click and drag down on the shadow area here, you can see that that S-curve, very much the same as Adobe Camera Raw, is giving us a higher contrast image. Same if I go the other way. So if I lift the bottom left-hand part of the curve, which is the shadow area, and drop the top right-hand part of the curve, and I'll just drop that down as well, you can see that that then reduces the contrast as we are raising the shadows and dropping the highlights. You can also see that even though there isn't control points per se there, it does maintain the shape of the curve that's been left there. So it does work differently, but it kind of works the same, if that makes sense. Not necessarily saying that either one is better or the other, whether it's Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, but it certainly does behave and perform a little bit differently in terms of manipulating that curve. So worth just experimenting to get used to it. If you have a look down the bottom here, we have what's called region as well, where using a slider bar you can increase or decrease the highlights. So just a different way of controlling the curve. Lights, darks obviously is the shadow area, and then the shadow is really the bottom part of the image as well. So again, raising the shadows, dropping the highlights, we can decrease the contrast. We're increasing the tonal range and tonal values of those highlight and shadow areas. Or conversely, if we want to make a contrastier image, I mean, this is an extreme example, but you can drop the shadows and increase the highlights quite easily there. If you just double click on those slider bars, it does take you back to the starting point, which is a value of 0. Just up here on the top left hand side of the tone curve panel as well, if we click on that, we can actually click and adjust by clicking and dragging on the actual image itself. So what that does is depending on what part of the image that we're actually clicking on, for example, if I click and drag on the highlights, it's going to drop the highlights. If I click and drag on the shadow, it's going to drop or increase the shadow areas. You can see it's not just that specific space, but everything that falls within that tonal range of that particular part of the image. And you can see that curve on the right hand side being adjusted as I'm making those changes. So there's a number of ways for you to interact with the image while making tone curve adjustments, which is really handy because sometimes it does prove to be beneficial to simply work on the actual image as opposed to working on the shape of the curve. And by choosing those different parts of the image, you're manipulating the curve, which you can go back in and change if you like, but you're actually choosing a specific area within the image in terms of tonal range value that you would like to adjust. So that is a really handy little tool just up there on the top left hand corner. If we click that, then we go back to the normal view and we can't click and drag any adjustments. So that's just the normal zoom in to 1:1 and zoom out. So fantastic option there. So what I'm also going to show down the bottom here is we have point curve options. If we click on that one, we've got linear, which is the process that we've been using, and to be honest, I would recommend that's the process that you would probably use for the majority of situations. Medium contrast and strong contrast. So these are kind of just like almost presets. As I mentioned, if you stick with linear, you can create medium and large contrast or higher contrast, but you have full control and autonomy over the actual curve itself, and obviously the results that you're going to get. Keeping in mind also, I'll just point out that as you make adjustments on the curve, you can see that those adjustments are being made to those sliders down the bottom. So very easy for you to go back in and say, for example, if you've increased the shadow areas or decreased the shadow areas, for example, a little bit too much, then you can simply double click on that shadow area and it will go back to its default. So back to the starting point, which is a good thing. So some great options there for use with the tone curve in Lightroom. As I mentioned in my previous video, curves is a really common and historically common method of adjusting tonal ranges, contrast, highlights, shadows, midtones within an image edit, and it's still a tool that's available in both of those platforms and definitely one worth investigating. It's a great tool and it works, which is the most important thing. As always, make those adjustments to achieve the results that you want to achieve, which could be different for each one of us. That's the main thing with creativity. We can do what we like. Hope you've enjoyed this video and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.